Welcome to the Murder Mystery History Show. This is the show that goes back in time to re-examine and discuss murder cases from long ago. Some famous cases, some forgotten cases. The show will primarily focus on murders from the 19th and early 20th century, but there'll be some flexibility. We might delve as far back as the 16 or 1700s. We may look at cases as recent as the 1960s. We'll see how we go. But for today's episode, we're going back in time to 1902, to rural South Australia, to look at the violent murder of a 13-year-old girl. The only witness is also the prime suspect. This is the murder of Bertha Schippan. So to start with, we're going to discuss the Schippan family. The family really starts with Matthias Schippan, the patriarch of the family. He was born in Germany in 1853, and at a pretty young age, when he's still basically just an infant, he's brought to Australia, arriving in Port Adelaide. There are some articles that I found that suggest that he had a pretty rough upbringing. Apparently his father was a bit of an angry alcoholic. I think his mother died pretty young, and his brother apparently was killed by a wolf. I assume that probably happened over in Germany. I'm not too sure. As Matthias got older, he met and married a woman by the name of Joanna Don't. Joanna was originally from Prussia, but she moved to Australia at the age of 9. So, together, and that's the thing, in South Australia, a lot of the people from that region and a lot of people from Germany, they ended up settling in a lot of the same areas in the hills, east of Adelaide. And so that's what they did in 1873. So once Matthias and Joanna were, they were grown up, they're married, they've moved together to the small township of Towitta. And they moved onto this, nice big block of land, farming land. They basically started up a farm there. Towitta is a really small township. Even today, it's barely even a town. It's very close to the town of Sedan, which is about 5 kilometres away. But the nearest city is the state capital, Adelaide, which is a little bit over 100 kilometres away. Which, of course, in 1902, that's a very long distance. And so, it was very much rural to them. It's a very quiet, isolated area. It's far away from people. It's very scenic, and it's quite beautiful out there. Lush green hills. There's a lot of vineyards out there these days. Coincidentally, Adelaide is my hometown, so I know a little bit about the area. Matthias and Joanna, they ended up having 7 children together. Pauline, Maria, Karl, Heinrich, August, Wilhelm, and Joanne. Most of the children are known by nicknames, though. So Joanne is better known as Bertha, because her middle name is Elizabeth. Maria is better known as Mary. August is referred to as Gustav, because that's his middle name. And Wilhelm is affectionately known to his siblings as Willie. The eldest child, Pauline, very sadly died of tuberculosis in 1899. So the matriarch of the family, Joanna, you look at photos of her and she kind of looks like she's got this kind of bitter scowl on her face. She looks very unapproachable, but that apparently isn't the case. There are articles and people saying that she's actually known for her, warm heart and kind nature and her hospitality. She's, very much popular amongst the community. Meanwhile, Matthias is kind of the polar opposite. He's known for having a very short fuse. He's got a lot of antisocial tendencies. He doesn't really socialize or mingle with the other locals. He's also very strongly religious. A lot of people tend to avoid him a lot, and he's known as being a very strict disciplinarian when it comes to his children. When I look at Matthias, like old photos of him, and read about him, I can't help but think of the old man from the first Home Alone movie, who all the kids think is like this creepy, murdering serial killer, because he's just such a bit of a hermit, but really he's a well-meaning man. But he is known for having a short fuse, and there are some altercations that he's had, which we'll go into in a little bit. December 27, 1901. Mathis and Joanna, they leave Towitta on a trip to Eden Valley. Eden Valley is about 25, 30 kilometers away, and they're going there to visit relatives because Joanna, much of her family has settled over in Eden Valley and Flaxman Valley. And so they leave behind Mary, Gustav, Wilhelm, and Bertha back at the house. Their other two older children, they're grown-ups now. They've moved out, and they don't spend a lot of time at home. And I believe at this point they were working on separate farms, so they're not at home. Mathis and Joanna, look, it's a simple little trip to visit relatives over the New Year's break, and they're planning on coming back on the 2nd of January. So now, of course, the 4 children at home. Now, Mary is the oldest. She's 24 years old, so she's an adult in her own right. Gustav, I believe, is around 18. Wilhelm, around 15. And Bertha is 13 years old. Some newspaper articles have her listed as being 14, but it appears that 13 is actually her correct age, because I think she's due for a birthday a little bit later in January, which, unfortunately, she never got to see. So January 1st, New Year's Day comes around, 1902. Gustav and Wilhelm spend the day hunting. They're hunting rabbits, foxes, birds. Meanwhile, Mary and Bertha stay home doing household chores, preparing dinner. And Mary and Bertha actually also work at a local cannery together. And locals note that Mary seems to come across as very motherly towards Bertha. More so motherly than as like a sister, and that's probably because of the big age difference between them. There's like 10 years age difference between them. Bertha is known as being very like outgoing and extroverted and like upbeat, and she's generally she's a pretty popular kid. People like her. At 8 p.m, all 4 Schippan children retire to bed for the night. The boys, they sleep in an outbuilding next to the barn, while Mary and Bertha, they actually share a bed inside the main house. Now, to lay out the land a bit here, Mathis has done a lot of work on the land that they've got. They purchased it from the government a few decades earlier, and he's built a big cottage, as well as there are some outbuildings, a barn, things like that. And it seems like the boys stay out, like not in the barn, but I think they're in a building next to the barn or a room attached to the barn. The house is very simplistic. By all descriptions of it, it seems to just be like a main like kitchen area. Then there's the master bedroom, which is like Mathis and Joanna's bedroom. And then there's the girls' bedroom, which is of course for Bertha and Mary, and they share a bed there. At about 10 p.m, Gustav and Wilhelm are awoken to the screams of their older sister, Mary. Mary comes running out of the house. She's screaming, she's in a panic, and she's calling out for Gustav's help. And she's crying that there's a man in the house, and he has a knife. The boys initially dismiss Mary. They just think, oh, she must be having a bad dream. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere, late at night, on New Year's Day with a knife? Why would that happen? But then they hear Bertha scream from inside the house. Now what's interesting is that Mary and Wilhelm, they stay in the boys' room. They stay hidden. They're too scared. And for Mary, being like the eldest, she's probably wanting to protect the boys as well. So I don't know what happened with that discussion, whether they discussed going into the house or not. But none of the 3 actually go into the house at this point. Instead, Gustav, he goes for help. He goes to a neighboring farm, and he goes to ask for help while Mary and Wilhelm stay behind. After a short while, Gustav returns, but he's by himself. The neighbor is unwilling to come and help them out. They're not interested. They close the door on him, which you can make of that what you will. I think it's pretty poor form to, not go and render aid, but I don't know, maybe the neighbor was elderly or sickly, or who knows. So together, the 3 children, feeling like they don't have any help and they're on their own, they arm themselves with pitchforks and they go into the house. Upon entering the house, they I believe they bring a lantern with them, a lamp, and they can see that the kitchen is covered with huge pools of blood all over the floor. Rather than venture any further, they don't go into any of the bedrooms. They just decide to leg it. They go and they leave, they run away. And they decide they're going to go to the Lambert farmhouse, which is about 1 kilometre away. Which doesn't sound too far, but you have to think that in the middle of the night, probably none of them are wearing shoes. They're in their pajamas and they're running through the countryside for 1 kilometre with very little, if any, light. Now, Lambert is the district constable, so he's like the local cop of the area. They go and bang on his door, and he's obviously more willing to help than the last neighbour that they spoke to. And he comes out, and he, putting yourself in his shoes, he's probably thinking, like, what are these kids on about? He probably doesn't see a lot of action. He's a rural country cop. He probably deals with minor, petty, neighbourly disputes, issues over farms, and maybe he gets the minor theft here or there. He's probably never had to deal with something of this caliber, a murderer in a house with a knife. So he armed himself with a staff and his pair of handcuffs, and he goes with the 3 kids back to their house. When he gets to the house, they find a grisly scene. Long trails of blood all throughout the kitchen, clumps of hair. The house is in total disarray. There's obviously been a major altercation. The blood trails through the kitchen and through Mathis and Joanna's bedroom and then into the girls' bedroom. There's a huge amount of blood everywhere. And when Lambert goes into the girls' bedroom, he finds Bertha on the ground, deceased. Her throat had been cut, ear to ear, multiple times. Her cheeks slashed. The back of her neck had been cut, and the back of her neck and head had been stabbed repeatedly. There were over 40 stab wounds on her body. It was a violent scene. Something that Constable Lambert had surely never seen before. Mary, Gustav, Wilhelm having to process what they've seen. Their younger sister, 13-year-old Bertha, was dead. Constable Lambert takes Mary, Gustav, and Wilhelm back to his home so that his parents can look after them and console them. Meanwhile, he rides on horseback to the nearest place where he can get any real help, which is Truro. Now that in itself is quite a long and kind of dangerous ride because he's riding at night, but obviously he has no choice. He can't sit around twiddling his thumbs because there's potentially a armed murderer on the loose and they need to take action quickly. But you also have to remember this is 1902. It's a relatively rural Australian town. There are no telephones out there, there's no radios, there's no way to get help easily. If you need help, you have to go and find it. So he gets to Truro and he raises the alarm. Mounted Constable Mowbray comes out from Truro and he comes out to the house in Towitta and he secures the scene first thing in the morning. He's soon joined by Dr. Steele from Angaston and the coroner, William Mulligan. So they secure the scene, they secure the crime scene. They obviously they get the kids back to the house and they're interviewing them. Mathis and Joanna, they return in the early afternoon of the 2nd of January 1902. And what they come back to is just awful. Just a bloody crime scene. Their youngest daughter dead in the most violent way you could imagine. And their home has now become a circus of police troopers, detectives, journalists, nosy neighbours coming to see what's up, what the fuss is. So now the investigation is underway. 15-man search party consisting of detectives and an Aboriginal tracker began searching the area for any sign of the offender or any evidence that may have been overlooked. They're obviously looking for, footprints, blood, perhaps a knife, things like that. I can't find any articles that talk about the outcome of the search, so all I can assume is that they found nothing. You would think that if they had found any evidence or any sign of someone in the area, that perhaps something would have been mentioned in the trial and in the following articles, but nothing is mentioned. So really, it seems like it was a fruitless search, unfortunately. So very soon after that, the coroner brings forward an inquest taking place in Towitta. During the inquest, Mary comes under very strong suspicion. So this inquest, it involves obviously the coroner, but also you've got detectives, you've got solicitors in there, some people kind of arguing, for her, some arguing against her, almost like a miniature trial itself. And there is a jury of 8 men present to sort of decide what they think happened. After being sworn in, Mary provides a statement, basically saying that she and Bertha had gone to sleep at around 8:30, and there were no lights in the house. It was all very dark, and then she was awoken at 10 p.m. The following is an excerpt from her statement that she gave. I awoke and felt something heavy lying across me. I turned around and a person jumped up. I got out of bed. He caught me by my 2 arms and pushed me up against the sewing machine. I got near to the kitchen door and I was knocked against the little table. I got near to the middle door and I felt he had something in his hand. I felt it was a knife. Whilst I was just near the middle door, I heard something drop. That was the knife. I got loose. I had an old skirt lying on the chair in my bedroom near the middle of the door leading to the kitchen. I caught hold of this and rushed out from the middle room, through the kitchen, out through the kitchen door, into the open air. Suspicion was on Mary. Blood had been found on her blouse. The belief was that, according to her, no blood had been shed when she had been disturbed in her sleep. She had managed to get out without any serious injury. She had complained of some neck pains, possibly from being thrown around, but there was no, she wasn't stabbed or cut or anything like that. And of course, this is in the time when forensic evidence isn't really a thing at all, and so they can't just test the blood to see whose blood it is. So the assumption is that it's quite possibly Bertha's blood. Further to that, the inquest reveals another little detail that incites a lot of controversy. Now, at this point in the inquest, detectives asked the public, because there had been a lot of people who came to this inquest, because this is building quite a big story throughout the state, and a lot of people were interested, and there were a lot of journalists and things like that there. So the detectives asked anyone who wasn't integral to the inquest, i.e. the jury, solicitors, things like that, to please leave. Because Mary disclosed that she had been secretly seeing a lover for the last 12 months. A young man local to the area by the name of Gustav Nitschke. Now, keep in mind this is 1902. A young unwed woman having relations with a man in secret, that was very newsworthy. And even somehow to some people, that was more condemning than anything else in the trial. Or the inquest, sorry. Especially considering that she was the daughter of Bertha Schippan, a very staunchly religious, disciplined man. And so it was a big shock and very surprising. And this said a lot about her character to a lot of the people who were following the trial. Gustav Nitschke spoke at the inquest. He admitted that he had been seeing Mary for the last 12 months, and they had spent the Sunday before New Year's Eve together. He admitted to improprieties, as he said, on half a dozen occasions with her. And there was some suspicion that perhaps Bertha was aware of their relationship. They had, engaged in relations in the Schippan household quite recently without anyone knowing. However, Bertha was in the house at the time. So the belief is that Bertha likely knew what was going on. Further to that, Gustav admitted, very oddly, that he had invited Bertha to come on a trip to the city with him, to come to Adelaide. It was a very strange thing, and apparently she had replied to him saying, no thank you, I think you should maybe ask Mary. The prosecution saw this as being highly improper, and it was suggested that Mary was likely responsible for her sister's murder. They had motive now, because they thought that either Gustav or Mary killed Bertha to try and hide the secret of their relationship, or potentially Mary killed Bertha out of jealousy, since it seemed like to some people Gustav was attracted to and interested in Bertha, even though she was only 13 and Gustav was around 21 at this time. Gustav, however, had an airtight alibi. He couldn't have been the killer. He was in Adelaide on the night of the murder, and there were multiple witnesses that could attest to this. So there was no way that he could have been in Towitta on New Year's Day to carry out this act. So he was in the clear and considered innocent. But with the secret relationship and the potential that Bertha knew this secret, there was still that motive there. And that, paired with the blood that was on Mary's blouse, really threw her into question. And then the jury came to a verdict, which the coroner read out. We, the jury, are of the opinion that Bertha Elizabeth Schippan met her death on the first night of January 1902 by having her throat cut by Mary Augusta Schippan. Mary was promptly charged with murder. Throughout the course of the inquest, she had remained very calm, and she was almost emotionless. Like, it just seemed like she was just detached from the whole thing. And even when the ruling was read out that she was going to be charged with the murder of her own sister, she remained unmoved. It wasn't until she was finally being taken away from Towitta by the police and she was forced to part ways with her mother that she broke down and started to cry. And of course, her mother, Joanna, she was distraught and just a wreck because in a few short days, she had lost her youngest daughter to a horrible, senseless murder, and now she was losing another daughter. The family never seemed to believe that Mary could be, responsible for this, that this could be possible. And so this just added more trauma and stress to them than they were already enduring. Mary was remanded in Adelaide Jail, a place where she would share space with thieves and prostitutes. There had only been one woman executed in the history of South Australia by this point. That was Elizabeth Woolcock, who was hanged for poisoning her husband about 30 years before this incident. Mary spent many weeks at the Adelaide jail with the possibility that she could become the second woman in the history of the state to be hanged. The trial became a huge news story in the entire state. Crowds of people swarmed both the jail and the courthouse. 1,500 people turned out at the courthouse to try and witness the proceedings. They all just wanted to catch a glimpse of Mary because she had become just such a huge polarizing figure across the state. Not only that, but it was big news in other states. It was news all across the country just because of the circumstances of it, the violent, malicious way that Bertha was killed, and the fact that the prime suspect is her very own sister. It really captured the attention of the public, and they all wanted to see what the outcome was. Sir Josiah Simon, King's Counsel, would represent Mary. He was considered to be all around very well spoken and very convincing in his defense of Mary. Gustav Nitschke also made a statement. And really, the media painted him out to be a real villainous character. The public did not care much for Gustav. They saw him as being just a horrible man, and almost like he was a bigger villain in this case than the actual murderer, even though there was no way that he could have been the murderer. He was just another player in this, but he wasn't involved directly in the killing. So hated was he by the public that the police had to take him under their protection. Whenever he would go to and from the courthouse, the public would hurl abuse at him, and they would follow him through the streets to the point that they were chasing him down and trying to attack him. He couldn't even get accommodation in Adelaide because so many people knew about him, and he'd been so talked about in the papers and publicly that no one wanted anything to do with him. No hotel manager wanted him staying in their hotel. It was very difficult for him to go anywhere because everyone had seen his photos in the paper. Everyone had heard all about him. He was public enemy number one. And I think a lot of that comes from the idea that people believed he probably had indecent intentions with Bertha, and also the fact that he was sleeping with Mary, who was an unwed woman, and he was doing it in secret. It was just a really controversial thing to happen. After nearly a full week at trial, the jury came to their decision. Mary Schippan was not guilty. There were reports that the public cheered and applauded and just were overall very positive on this decision, because by the end of the trial, most of the public viewed Mary as another victim in this. She was a poor girl who had been through a horrible ordeal, and it was really hard to believe that someone like Mary, who had no criminal background and came from such a quiet religious family, that she could do that to her own sister. So it was very much seen that she was another victim, and that she was, an injustice was being done by her having to go through this whole criminal proceeding. No further charges were ever laid. And the suspect, the unknown assailant who Mary Schippan claims entered her bedroom on January 1st, 1902, proceeded to murder her younger sister, that man was never found. And you can see from the police's perspective that, the boys never went into the house. They never saw a killer. No one but Mary saw a killer. And even her, she couldn't describe him because it was dark. There was no real description of him. And so, with Mary having that secret lover, certain members of the police and solicitors, they saw that as, that's condemning. She's keeping secrets. That says a lot about her character. And there we go, we have motive for a potential murder. After the trial, the public continued to view Gustav Nitschke as a villain, just a man of really questionable morals. He found it difficult to really go anywhere in South Australia because everyone just hated him so much. And even though he technically was innocent of any wrongdoing, he was still seen as like the villain of the trial. There are some reports, like I found an article that said that Mary and Gustav ended up marrying each other and moving to Port Pirie, but other articles state otherwise. There's one article that suggests that Gustav changed his name and moved to Victoria, whereas there's other articles that also suggest that Mary either returned to Towitta or moved to Lights Pass, living a relatively withdrawn and reclusive life where she never married and just kept to herself, because obviously after a situation like this, she probably didn't want to be seen in the public eye ever again. Mary would sadly follow her sister Pauline's fate, and in 1919, to this day, whoever murdered poor Bertha Schippan remains a mystery. There are those who still believe that Mary did it. They found blood on Mary's clothes, and I can't find any follow-up in the trial or any of the articles that explains why she had that blood on her clothes. I mean, it's quite possible that maybe she got the blood on her clothes when she went back into the house with her brothers. Perhaps she went in the kitchen and somehow got some on her. Maybe when she woke up, she didn't realize it, but maybe she had been attacked, or maybe Bertha had already been attacked without her realizing, and she got blood on her then. It's hard to know. There's no real way of knowing at this point, obviously. She was able to escape the house, and she got help. You can kind of judge, and I think there's some judgment on, did the three siblings act as best as they could? Would it have been better if, look, there was three of them, arm themselves with pitchforks, go straight back in the house? But instead they didn't. And I can understand, like, her fight or flight reflexes would have kicked in, and at the end of the day she probably decided, well, there's not anything I can do for Bertha now. I need to protect my brothers. Did she kill Bertha to protect a secret from her very strict religious parents? Did she kill Bertha because she was jealous? Did she think that Gustav was attracted to her? There are some people out there that think the real murderer was in fact Mathis, the father. Going back to 1896, Mathis had actually been in an altercation with three young boys in the area. I believe that they had been egging him on and taunting him, and the altercation resulted in him firing at them with his rifle, and one of them was actually wounded. Mathis was arrested and he had to stand trial. Fortunately for him, the charges were dropped. Mathis has that short fuse that could lead to him becoming violent. There are some people that suspect that perhaps Bertha knew something about him that he didn't want her knowing. I've read some articles where people suggested that he was responsible for another murder in the area, but I can't find any serious evidence or anything that at all backs that up, and I think that's a lot of hearsay. And the idea that Mathis could have left Eden Valley in the dead of night, ridden all the way back home, murdered Bertha, and then rode all the way back to Eden Valley without anyone noticing, I think that's a little bit absurd. I think that's too far-fetched, and it's just so unlikely that that could have happened, and it doesn't make sense for it to have gone down like that. Another thing that I think perhaps clears Mary a little bit, maybe doesn't clear her, but you have to question, why would she have killed Bertha if she was planning on doing it? Why kill her when she did? Because as we know, the two boys, Gustav and Wilhelm, they had been out all day hunting. It was just Bertha and Mary at home by themselves. That probably would have been the more opportune time to carry out a murder, because you know that you're alone and you have time to set the scene and do what you want, and you don't have any risk of, the boys coming into the house when you're not expecting them. You know you're on your own. So over a century later, there's still a lot of questions in the air. No one knows who did it. And it's one of those cases that it's never going to be solved because it's just too far gone. And it's one of those cases that, obviously if it happened today, they likely would catch the culprit thanks to forensic evidence. There would have been faster police response because obviously they were limited by the resources of the time. Personally, I'm open to the idea that a stranger did this. In the time that it took for her brother Gustav to get help, whilst Mary and Wilhelm hid in the boys' room, to the time that he returned, the killer could have easily done what he needed to do or what he wanted to do and left. There were multiple exits in the house. I believe there were at least 3 doors that could lead out of the house. So there were a lot of different ways for him to escape without being seen. And you have to remember that Mary and Wilhelm weren't out there watching the house. By what I've read, it sounds like they were hiding and keeping themselves safe. So anything could have happened in that time. And also keep in mind, the killer could have still potentially been in the house when the 3 Schippan kids went to investigate it, because they didn't check any of the bedrooms. So by the time they had ran the 1 kilometer to the Lambert's house and ran all the way back, he could have done a lot, and he could have cleared a lot of ground in getting away. So, yes, it's possible that Mary did it. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. And the nature of the murder being stabbed so many times, like over 40 times, that suggests like such like anger and rage, and it just doesn't make sense from everything that we know about Mary. What do you think of this case? Who do you think's responsible? Do you think Mary killed her own sister? Do you think Mathis somehow made it back in the night and killed Bertha for whatever reason? Do you think a stranger was responsible? Do you have a different hot take altogether on this? I've set up an Instagram page, Murder Mystery History. Check it out, leave comments. This is the first episode I've done. I live in a very noisy area, which may be apparent. I don't know how well it's coming out in the recording. I've got roadworks up the street. I have birds flying around. My neighbor never shuts the hell up, but I'm hoping that I've managed to conceal most of the noise. And I'm going to try and work on working over the noise over the coming weeks. I've got ideas for follow-up episodes. I'm thinking I might do 2 a month. Leave your comments. What did you think of the episode? What did you like? What didn't you like? What could I do better? Did you like it? Would you listen to more? If you don't like it, then don't listen again. If you did like it, thanks for listening, and I hope you listen to the next one. Thanks.